We're talking about, yes, elements of mystery, from the first one on. First, you have an unusual detective of high intelligence who employs methods of deductive logic. You don't have to get this word for word today. And Dupin is, if you just read the first couple of pages of the Murders in the Rue Morgue, and he and his buddy are walking along the streets of Paris, and they've been silent for 15 minutes. At which point Dupin says to him something like, yes, you're right, he's too short to act in those roles. And the guy just looks at him, and he's like, how did you know what I was thinking? And he goes back and he traces it. Well, 15 minutes ago, you stumbled on a paving stone, and then I saw you do this, and then I saw you do that, and I saw you look up at the sky, and then I remembered I mean, you just sit there and, okay. So, then you have, of course, as I said, he and his buddy, you have an assistant of lesser intelligence. Think Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Then you have, this is the third element, a member of the police force. I wouldn't say he's an idiot, who is less effective than our master sleuth. Inspector Lestrade, yes. Then you have a varied assortment of misleading clues. Okay, they're absolutely intended to steer you in a different direction.
Red herrings?
Red herrings. And finally, now this was tradition which has pretty much gone by the wayside, but you still see it in every now and then. A gathering of the suspects at the story's climax, the denouement, so that somebody may hear the detective's explanation. Otherwise, you know, what's he going to do? Just tell one person? No fun. All right. Now, unfortunately, nobody liked Poe's stories very well. They were a new literary genre, and they did not strike at the hearts of the American public, who preferred his tales of phantasmagoria to his tales of ratiocination. Isn't that a great word? I had to look up the pronunciation because I always want to pronounce it ratio. It's spelled R-A-T-I-O. Those were his phantasmagoria stories, yes. However, in 1876, a young man named Arthur Conan Doyle is at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. And he meets, one of his instructors is a surgeon named Joseph Bell. And Joseph Bell is, and I quote, a thin and lean man with a hawk-like nose, penetrating eyes, and an uncanny gift for observation and deduction. And his talent for diagnosis is legendary. He could tell at a glance not only what a patient's ailment was, but also his trade or profession, and what part of the country or the world he came from. And I have to read this to you because I thought it was wonderful. An example of Bell's uncanny ability took place on a day when Doyle interviewed a man with swollen limbs. Finished, he sent the patient to the lecture chamber. Bell began his examination with a statement, not a question. Well, my man, you served in the army, I see. Aye, sir, came the patient's reply. Remember, Bell had not seen any of Doyle's notes. Doyle took the initial notes. Bell hadn't seen them. Not long discharged? No, sir. A Highland Scottish regiment? Aye, sir. And you were stationed in Barbados? The patient nodded, while Doyle and the other students watched in amazement. Then their instructor explained his deductions. You see, gentlemen, the man is respectful, yet he did not remove his hat. In the army, they did not. But he has not been long discharged, or he would have learned civilian ways. His speech tells us he's a Scot. His air of authority marks him as an officer, but other factors point to the non-commissioned rather than the regular officer. A sergeant or corporal, I should think. As to Barbados, that was simple, gentlemen. He complains of elephantiasis. Actually, they don't have, elephantiasis. Elephantiasis. Okay. Elephantitis. They have another E in there. That's why I'm getting stuck, Judy. It's another A. As a disease found in the West Indies, never in Britain. So, they don't seem to be able to get my message. Okay.
17 in one school when you make it 17.
Now we have a vaccine. This is so wonderful.
I'm pulling up
It's the writer's voice.
Okay. This has never happened before, as far as I know. That lady, no. Somebody's going to do some investigating here when we're finished, you know. Okay, in 1883, so this is 7 years later, Boyd Doyle was a fairly unsuccessful dentist.
one of the two-star.
Did you know he was a dentist? No. Yeah, he's a dentist. He used the times when he had no patients, which was most of the time, to do some writing. And he wanted to write nonfiction and had been singularly unsuccessful. And he needed money. He'd been reading Poe. And he'd also been reading the newspapers and kind of solving the crimes in the newspaper as puzzles. And he got very interested in the idea of writing a mystery. And he started to think about his days at college and medical school, and he decided to model his detective after Joseph Bell. And Sherlock Holmes was born. In a matter of weeks, this boggles the mind, but you know, if they could build the Empire State Building in 1 year, I guess he could write it in a week. He could write that in a week. In a matter of weeks, he wrote the first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, for which he was paid a grand total of £25. Wow, all right. Not compared to what they get nowadays, right? It did not have the English public beating down his door, though the publisher saying, more, more, more. However, an American publisher read it and thought it was absolutely terrific, and he commissioned Doyle to write a second one, which was The Sign of the Four, and that did it. All of a sudden, everybody was reading Sherlock Holmes, and the detective novel took off. Became so popular that before Doyle, he wanted to write other kinds of works, and they didn't want him to. 10 years after he first started writing about Sherlock Holmes, he kills them all in a story called The Final Problem. Yeah, he thought it was going to be the end of it, and it wasn't. 10 years later, well, you know, he got this idea for the Hound of the Baskervilles, and the only way, since he killed Holmes off, he published it before he brought him back to life. He had it seem as if it were a manuscript that Watson found, you know, but that started the whole thing up again. Things had just started to die down. People were willing to accept, okay, Sherlock was Holmes is dead, even though he was still getting nasty letters that said, "You brute, how could you do that?" So 10 years later, he brings Sherlock Holmes back. And from the dead, yes. By the turn of the century, everybody is reading detective novels, and Mark Twain included. And everybody, Dickens, by the way, I said nobody was doing Poe in America. Dickens started to write mysteries after he read Poe. The last work that he did was The Mystery of Edward Drood, remember, which is unfinished. And so was Wilkie Collins. He did The Moonstone, and yeah, so, I mean, there were a few people who thought, oh, this is a really good idea. But by 1900s, early 1900s, everybody's reading them, everybody's writing them. In America, start with England, sorry, go back. In England, G.K. Chesterton and the Father Brown mysteries. Father Brown was, after Sherlock Holmes, one of the first serial detectives. And he objected, Chesterton wanted just not the pure intellectual, he combines with Father Brown the idea that instinct, that intuition, that a knowledge of human nature and of human motivations can bring you to an answer almost as well as deduction and logic. In America, Mary Roberts Reinhardt, does anybody remember that? Lord. I think she was probably one of the first writers I read, mystery writers. Introduced the first popular woman detective. There had been other women in fiction. There was one actually written in the 1860s, but they have no idea, they don't know who wrote it. But they had it was a woman detective. Anyhow, she popularizes a woman detective who is a nurse named Hilda something. Talk over it. Named Hilda something, who she calls Miss Pinkerton because she's a nurse, but she works for a detective agency. She also threw in a little romantic subplot now and then, and all of a sudden, women. Up until that time, detective stories had been considered almost exclusively a masculine genre. And with Mary Roberts Reinhardt, suddenly women were reading it. Not to be outdone, guess who shows up in England? Agatha. Okay, so Agatha Christie shows up. The foremost early American mystery writer was a guy named S.S. Van Dyne, and his detective was one Philo Banks. In short order, Charlie Chan, Sam Spade, Lord Peter Wimsey, Nero Wolfe, Perry Mason all joined the ranks of detectives. But it's not really until 1929, when some guy named Ellery Queen shows up, that we get new twists. Stories not written in the first person. Stop and think, the Poe stories were all first-person narratives by the sidekick. So the Holmes stories, they're supposedly all written by Watson. Ellery Queen shows up, and lo and behold, the author is Ellery Queen. The detective hero is a guy named Ellery Queen, who is a writer of detective fiction. So that's a new one. There is also a point at which, in its early novels, which I have to tell you, I mean, Ellery Queen was my first, after Nancy Drew, was my first mystery person, because my mother collected the Ellery Queen books. So we had the French powder mystery, the Roman hat mystery, the Greek coffin mystery, the Egyptian cross mystery, all these things, same formula. And towards the end of each one, he stops and says, "Challenge to the reader." It was an attempt to make the reader a detective as well. And it's the first time that it was done. Aside from that, before Ellery Queen, you could just kind of read along, and you didn't have to do anything, just you're reading, you're finding out. He says, "Okay, stop. You figure it out." So, and then Dashiell Hammett comes along. He's tired of intellectual detectives, so you start to get the hard-boiled guys. So Sam Spade and Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe. Marlowe? Yeah, Philip Marlowe. I wrote down Philip Morris. I wonder where he was coming from. I know I'm smoking too much. I always smoke too much when I'm reading. So, Poe births it, Doyle nurtures it, and Queen guides it to maturity. And he really does. Okay, so I couldn't decide what order I was going to do these in. And then I decided,